Do you find it hard to explain to friends and family what you now do? Are you wasting valuable time by attempting to figure out challenges on your own? We have created a community for ex-corporate people running their own business who want to live a life they love whilst giving back to their community. This is the Build, Live, Give show. We bring you first-hand experiences of guests going through many of the struggles you face each and every day. We get real with no corporate BS. And now your host, Paul Higgins.
Welcome to the Build, Live, Give podcast, episode number 14. Hi, I'm Paul Higgins and I'm your host. And today we've got a guest, Alexander Robinson. He's from a company called Airly and he's one of the co-founders there. And he really talks about a key pain point that most of us have, and that's domestic air travel. He started doing his pilot training and then he left that to go chase the corporate dream. And it was great for a while and he worked for one of the biggest brands in the world. But as he said, there was 7 years he was in corporate, 5 of them were really good and then the other 2 not so. And it actually really impacted him personally, and also he's married. So he talks about that during the podcast, some of the struggles he had. And then he went out and wanted to solve a real big pain point, as I said, which is around domestic travel. And the model that he first launched wasn't quite right and he's pivoted. So he goes through that and how he's gone about the journey of seeking funding, and he's also got some other great actionable advice. And he also talks about a cause that he's really passionate about, which is equality. So it's a fantastic podcast, so get your pens and paper ready. What's been happening in the community? It continues to grow, and there's lots of great 5-star reviews. If you're listening to this for the first time, or if you listened before and you haven't left a review, we'd love to have a review. It helps build this community up. Also, if you'd like to know more about the Build, Live, Give community, just go to Facebook. You can search it, Build, Live, Give, and it's a free closed Facebook group where people that have left corporate, running their own business, living a great life, and want to give back can all be. And we all in there helping each other on a day-to-day basis. There's no spam. It's all great help and content. And also, if you love the podcast, please subscribe. It'd be fantastic to have you as a ongoing listener. So grab your pens and paper, get ready for Alexander Robinson from Airly. Welcome, Alexander Robinson, co-founder of Airly, to Build, Live, Give podcast. So, Alexander, today we're going to go more into your story, but why don't you just kick us off with a little bit about your backstory, where it started up until now?
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. I like to see myself as having tried and gone through a few different careers. When I was at school, I always wanted to be a fast jet fighter pilot in the Air Force. That was what I was focused on. That's what I studied for. And I made it through the selection criteria. I did my degree in the Air Force. I did my officer training and I started pilot training. But somewhere along that journey, I can pinpoint it, I realized I didn't want to be a military pilot. I realized that pilots are very specialized professions, and military pilots, or the military in general, doesn't necessarily reward a broader career or critical thinking or challenging. And that's not to disrespect pilots or the military. It just didn't suit me for what made me tick. So I didn't pass fast jet training and I left the Air Force and pursued what I thought was what I wanted in a career, which was broader challenges, facing humans, facing other people, facing businesses, and developing really an understanding of the broader commercial sector. So I looked at a whole range of options, and for me, Caterpillar and I clicked. Caterpillar being the large multinational mining and equipment manufacturer. I really enjoyed a career with them for 7 years. Or I should say 5 years. After about 5 years of new challenges and learning and trying new things and succeeding and failing as well, I started to see that the path that I was on was very typical of a corporate ladder career. The next period of my career would probably be 3 years to 5 years in certain roles, slowly progressing laterally or slightly upwards until I was in a management position, maybe in 10 or 15 years. And beyond that, executive manager, vice president, etc. That's fine for some people, but what I wanted was a career of more diversity, of more challenges, of more risk, and of more learning. So I actually resigned after 6 years, was convinced to stay a seventh year, and took a redundancy after that. And what I went back to was what I really enjoyed most. I looked hard at what I enjoyed most during my Air Force period and also during Caterpillar. And for me, it was ongoing challenges, lean teams, team building, a certain level of risk, trying new things, looking at what problems could be solved differently. And for me, all of those elements screamed for the startup world. That's what the startup world looked from the outside for me. So I threw myself into the startup world, and that really just involved me looking at meetups, conferences, attending those, working out of co-working spaces, connecting, trying to understand the ecosystem better. And along this journey, as I was trying to find a fit for whether I could bring my skills across to the startup world or how I could, I met two co-founders that coincidentally were trying to solve something that I was quite passionate about, which was still aviation. And it was also using technology to solve a problem, which was air travel. Air travel is quite inefficient between major capital cities, and Melbourne to Sydney is one of the worst. And that's what Airly is. It's an attempt to fix the inefficiencies of air travel using technology and using different thinking and different means. So smaller airports, smaller aircraft, a membership subscription business model, and trying to do things differently. And that's what I've been working on the last 15 months. That's where we are today. Thanks, Paul. I'm sorry that went a bit long.
No, that was great. It was a great backdrop, and I'm sure listeners would really appreciate you going through that. If you just step outside your work for a moment, what's one thing that someone, either a friend or a family member, would know about Alexander outside of work?
That's a good question. It's there's two ways to look at that, I think, and one is the lesson for me, and the other is probably more the fun element, and they both sort of combine. What I mean by that is I love challenges. I love trying to solve things. I love trying to work on problems. I love push my own limits, and that manifests itself unhealthily sometimes. When I get stressed, I push myself really hard, whether it's training for a marathon or trying to train for an Ironman, or trying to study as well as work at the same time, and just trying to balance too much. And for me, that is me trying to deal with stress by setting more challenges to focus on or distract myself from the stress. So that's something that a few people know about me and that I need to be mindful of. But that also, the flip side of that, the more enjoyable side of that, is people know I love running. And I've discovered that for me, running is as much, it's probably more about my own mental well-being and physical well-being. If I can go for a run daily, or at least every 2 days, it means I can perform better, I can think clearer, I can feel more positive and better about just my own state, and that helps me work better.
Excellent. And look, I do daily meditation, but I once spoke to someone quite learned in this area, and they said, what else do you do? And I said, I go for a bike ride every day. And they said, look, that's just a form of meditation. You're singular focused on a particular activity. You're letting thoughts go in, but you're just observing the thoughts. If you're doing that on your bike, so that's fine. You don't have to be sitting still to do that. So it sounds like running's that for you.
Exactly. And what you've just said, I can see how that works with cycling as well. And I think I once read or heard that the repetitive footfall of running, particularly if you can get away from roads and traffic and other people, so like trail runs, for instance, or even just around the Yarra, are a terrific repetitive, focused activity that takes your mind away from itself and just allows your body to focus on what it's doing.
Great. And if we just go back to Caterpillar, so I love the analogy of, 7 years, 5 really happy, 2 maybe not. Was there anything holding you back from taking that leap out of leaving the comfort of Caterpillar into the unknown of a startup?
Yeah, that's a really good question. fear was what held me back. And I look back at the 18 months that I've been in the startup world, and that saw a lot of change for me personally. I actually went through a marriage breakdown, almost 2.5 years ago. So during that period of a lot of stress, and that wasn't a catalyst, but it was certainly related. And I'm happy to go into that because it ties into my corporate life. But really, to answer your question, what held me back was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of whether I would be sacrificing a cost of a successful career at Caterpillar with stock options and a very clear career path that would offer me job security for likely 20, 30, 40 years. And that's attractive in some ways, but in terms of what I knew about myself and I learned about myself, which was that's not what makes me tick or makes me happy or challenges me or feeds my my enjoyment in life and in work. I had to make a choice, I made a choice to not go for that comfortable life and take a risk of what was not known. And it's really hard to make that risk. I know you know that, and everyone else on this show that you've spoken to knows that. But it's really not that scary after you take it. It's like almost anything. Once you actually try something that's scary or looks scary from the other side, and you realize that it just opens up a lot more opportunities, and it exposes you to new ways of learning, new ways of doing things, new opportunities, new people, new networks. That's the exciting part. And I think with everything, we have to keep I have to keep my mind open to not becoming too comfortable in any particular state, because then it does potentially close down my appetite for what's to come.
Look, I think that's great advice. And I know other people have mentioned on the podcast that actually it's some of their colleagues now that are in those jobs that they thought have had all that security, particularly in Australia. And now they're realizing that that's not the case. They're sort of, it's like Russian roulette. They're waiting for the next wave of, I don't know what they call it now, but effectively downsizing. They'll have a new term. It sort of changes, as you know. But they're the ones, and they're sort of looking at people like yourself and myself, knowing that you go on a roller coaster running your own business, but at least it's more in control, or you're more in control than that unknown of when's my number going to come up. So I think you really touch on a great point, and I think a lot of people listening to this podcast are either just made that shift like you have, or are thinking about that shift. And I think it's it's excellent where you say the fear is sometimes much greater, and also what you realize is that there's a lot of help out there once you make the change. And based on that help, what sort of help have you received to help overcome some of those fears for you?
That's a good question. I think two forms are really accessible and that I can really reflect on. The first is that I'm not the only one going through this journey. So everyone who takes this journey, there are always people that have done it before, who have gone from probably more comfortable jobs that have higher career prospects, that are probably higher paying and offer more stability. They have taken the leap of faith into something that they're more passionate about, or that they're more interested in, or that they're wanting to explore. So there's always people out there, and whether it's in the startup world, or whether it's people that have just decided to do industry changes or work for different companies, people that have gone through that change process, that have been forced or have chosen to try something new that they're unfamiliar with and potentially afraid of. They will have success stories, and they have failures that they've learned from. And finding those people, and just being vulnerable about where I've come from and that I don't know what I'm doing or where I'm going, I've found to be a very helpful way to reciprocate or to gain reciprocal trust and advice from people that have done that before. And I suppose the second element in that of where advice and help has been found has been in the startup community. So as I mentioned, working out of co-working spaces, going to conferences and meetups and meeting this range of people that are in a far less sure space, because things move much quicker. They're working on a solution that might be a commercial success or it might not be. And people in these spaces tend to be taking greater risks than working for a stable corporate. These people also were great sources and are great sources of help for me to show that while I might be taking a risk in what I've moved from and to, if it works or if it doesn't work, things will be okay. People are going through this change and this transient period, and people land on their feet. Being open to failure and potential failure is an important part of that. And startup communities are a great opportunity to find them.
Excellent. Look, that's great advice. And for you now, I know that, the last time we spoke, you're very much at the formation part of your startup. But when you walk into a room or you're in one of those communities and someone says, Alexander, what do you do? How do you describe what you do?
Yes, just to reflect on what you said, you were one of the first people I reached out to when I was going through this process of leaving a corporate and trying to figure out how to land on my feet and whether it would work. And you were extremely valuable. You gave me no specific advice, but I could see that you had done it. You had gone from Coca-Cola, I recall, and you were still exploring what you wanted to do. And I think you'll always be exploring, because I certainly will be. And I think if I was looking for a golden bullet or a silver bullet, when we had that meeting, I've since learned that there won't be any particular piece of advice. There's more just an observation of other people that have gone through it and that are willing to share their experiences and successes and failures like you did. But if people ask what I'm doing now, in a nutshell, I say I'm trying to solve a big problem in travel. And I have co-founded a startup called Airly that is using technology to look at different ways of solving transport inefficiencies between major cities, specifically Melbourne, Sydney, trying to do it faster at a more, using a different business model that makes more sense for frequent travelers.
Great. And if you can just elaborate on that model,
Sure.
Yeah, I'd love to let listeners know. A lot of our listeners, want to avoid the what's the right word? The corporateness, I suppose, of the way they used to travel, and are always looking for different options. So, how could you serve their needs better?
I'm always happy to talk about this topic. So, to set the scene and the context, Sydney to Melbourne is one of the busiest air routes in the world, 9 million passengers a year, third busiest in the world, and busiest in the English-speaking world. Australia's golden triangle of travel includes Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, and Adelaide, as well as Tasmania. And these city pairings where there's a high degree of business travel exist all around the world. There's over 1 billion annual passengers that have this problem or have this need to commute between major capital cities. So being in Australia and seeing this problem firsthand and having traveled that route, almost on a weekly basis when I was with Caterpillar, I could see some of the problems and experience them firsthand. For instance, you can spend more time getting to the airport, going through security, going through check-in, bag drop, waiting at the lounge, walking to the gate, waiting to board, and then boarding itself. These moments are very disruptive for a working professional, because you can't really concentrate on any activity, whether it's an email or reading a report or even an article, for a very long period of time. And you also need to be mindful of where you are and what's happening and where you need to be next. So that's the first-hand experience, but also the actual organization of an airport and business travel has not changed a great deal in terms of the growth of air travel. What I mean by that is when you board a Sydney-Melbourne flight now, a commercial flight, whether you travel weekly or whether you travel for a holiday once a year, the same people are boarding that flight. There's no real service differentiation. And there's 180 to 300 people on that aircraft, which is the same amount that will be boarding for, say, an international flight. So there's no real efficiency gain in whether you're traveling domestically for a short haul or whether you're traveling internationally for a long haul. People still go through the same process as they're getting to that flight. So that's the problem. And we looked at what we could do to solve that. And there's a startup in the US called Surf Air that actually tried to solve this same problem between Los Angeles and San Francisco about 4 years ago now. And they looked at a membership model, so a membership business model with unlimited flying between those two cities on smaller aircraft using metropolitan airports. We looked at whether we could do something similar, and Sydney has Bankstown Airport, Melbourne has Moorabbin and Essendon, Brisbane has Archerfield. We thought we'd start looking into, could we build a potential business model around this? And we put together a pretty sound concept. We received quite a bit of attention when we announced what it was we were trying to do, which was really, the intent of that was to see whether this was a problem and a solution that people were willing to pay for. And straight away, we got quite a bit of feedback. And that was one of our early pivots. And the reason I mention this is it led to where the business model is now, which is instead of turboprops, King Airs, which is what the US uses, that example I gave earlier, we look at twin engine Citation or Learjets for a couple of reasons. It's more efficient, and the distances between Sydney and Melbourne call for a jet rather than a turboprop. So we introduced that. We looked at those airports that I mentioned. They work very well for the cities that we're trying to pair. And the business model of subscription basis is slightly different. We learned from that feedback that not everyone's looking for unlimited air travel. Some are only looking for potentially 2 flights a month. So we needed to look at whether we could have tiers of membership. But probably one of the biggest bits of advice that helped with a pivot was from one of the VC firms that we were speaking to as we were looking for funding, who didn't end up funding us, but gave us the bit of advice that what we needed to do was basically be 10 times better in some capacity over a commercial airline. Because only by being 10 times better, or using the phrase 10x, only by being that would we be able to help loyal customers to an airline program switch and make that opportunity switch from their preferred airline to us. And what that solution looked like for us was door-to-door travel. And this had been a concept we were toying around with in our head for a while. And what that means is, all those discrete activities that I mentioned before of waiting at the airport and going through those individual activities, a big component that's missing from that is the actual ground transport. So how could we make the entire journey from your home in Melbourne to an office in Sydney? How can we connect all of that so that it's just one event? So you just need to make it as easy as booking an Uber, but you have a car pushed to you, you have a plane ready to go, and it's all optimized so that you're using as little time as possible and you're the most efficient that you can be. So that's what we came up with.
Fantastic. And look, I think, that's for anyone listening that is on their journey I think that test and iterate is so important. You hear it all the time, whether it's Eric Ries or whatever book you read around this lean startup concept. But I think that's testament to you guys following that approach. And just for listeners, before we move on to the next section, when do you think you'll actually have your first maiden journey?
I'm glad you asked. Thanks, Paul. We're looking to launch in second quarter this year. We've been delayed a few times, and that's more or less because it's capital intensive. We've had terrific feedback and traction from a market perspective. This is clearly a problem that not just me and my co-founders have identified, but many people feel the same way. That's been I won't say it's easy to gain members, but we've found it quite easy to find people that are having this problem and that we can talk to about whether they need an early solution. The harder part has been funding. So as we're continuing down the funding journey, we've got some good opportunities that we're just looking to close, and we're expecting a second quarter this year launch. Excellent.
Fantastic. And look, there'll be links in the show notes so that people who are interested and want to find out more, they certainly can. If I sort of fast forward now to the way that you live your life day to day, can you sort of talk to us about a typical day for you, if there is such a thing?
That's a fun question. So I work out of Inspire 9, which is a co-working space in Melbourne. I tried a range of co-working spaces, and for me, Inspire 9 suited me the best. It just had the right feel and the right infrastructure and support and community management, etc. So that's where I work from. And my co-founders, Luke and Ivan, are in there sometimes. Usually they're in other parts of Melbourne, just being a flexible co-founding team. So if I'm in the office, which is probably half the week, what I enjoy doing is, catching up on my business planning, emails, and speaking with members and potential members and partnerships. But what I find really interesting and energizing about working out of a co-working space is, to give the example of Caterpillar. When I was with Caterpillar, I felt like we all worked for the same company, but no one knew what anyone really did. And so there's no real sense of community, except that you're all by default working for the same company, and that's your community. What I found really interesting about co-working spaces is everyone's working for a different company, so you need to reach out to these people on a personal level and a relationship level to actually understand what they're doing and who they are. And it forced me to talk to these people that I work alongside, understand what they're doing, and subsequently learn from them. There's been some really cool startups at Inspire 9 that I've learned from personally, but we've also borrowed some ideas to try with Airly. And there's companies like Rome to Rio and Culture Amp, Etsy, that are very successful startups that are going through a very different stage of growth to Airly. But then there are also completely different organizations and startups that are focused on purely scientific problems or fintech problems. And while they're not necessarily directly relevant in terms of what they're trying to solve, or to give the analogy of when I was with Caterpillar, you're all working for the same company, but you don't know what everyone else is necessarily doing. In a co-working space, no one's working for the same company. So the only way to build a community is to reach out on a personal and relationship level to really understand what others are doing. And there's a lot of benefits. One, to discover what those people are working on and whether there's different ways of reframing a problem. Or two, their networks they've certainly helped with me and with Airly as we've spoken through what we're trying to solve. There's invariably what have you spoken to so-and-so, and have you thought about this, that I haven't found outside of a co-working space to the same degree.
Yeah, look, I think it's great. And I think, part of this podcast and the Build, Live, Give community is a similar thing. It's exact ethos. And I think it's, for me, what I realized in corporate is that I was very much a community-minded person and couldn't quite understand when not everyone wanted to take a similar philosophy. But then I realized the only way to really get paid more or to get remunerated more was to get a promotion. So effectively, one promotion, 10 people. So it became very competitive in that nature. Whereas I think with startups, everyone's got a specific problem they're trying to solve, and we're all going about it to solve it. So everyone actually wants to help you solve that, because 9 out of 10 times they've actually got that problem themselves. So I think, you've got a massive pool of opportunities versus a very narrow set within corporate. So I totally agree with you. And I think co-working spaces are great. We're part of one. And also, that's where Build, Live, Give as a community is positioned to actually help people. And I think that's a great thing about these type of communities. So
Definitely.
I totally agree with you. If we sort of move forward now, as far as the give section, what cause or community are you passionate about, and why?
That's a really strong element of Build, Live, Give. And thanks for asking. What I learned at Caterpillar, or even earlier in the Air Force, was that diversity is super important. It's important from an ideas generation perspective. It's important from an equality perspective. It's important for a pure business performance perspective. It's important from a social cause perspective. And as I went through my various careers and journeys, I learned that in the Air Force, I saw that diversity or a lack of diversity was a problem. At Caterpillar, having realized that, I could start to address it. So I joined an employee affinity group, as it was called, which was women in leadership at Caterpillar. And that was the intent of that, was to really help promote diversity and equality for business results. And that I enjoyed. And then, having left Caterpillar, the startup community is still not as diverse as it needs to be. And what I would like to see, and what we need to do as Airly and as founders of Airly, is promote diversity. So while we have founders from different backgrounds, we're all male. And that's a big problem that we haven't solved yet. So as we start to hire people, one of our first hires that we have penciled in is a female. And that's not just because she's female, it's because she brings a wealth of aviation experience, and she is a professional that has skills and experience that we don't have, but that we also need for our business. And it's terrific that she is a female, but we need to, I'm very conscious that we're a founding team of males, and that we're still in we're not in as diverse an ecosystem as we need to be.
Excellent. Well, I agree, and certainly from our listeners' point of view, it's a really good mix of diversity from age, but also gender, and those two things, and in some ways culture and nationality, because we are a global body. But I think that's so important, and it's a cause that's close to my heart as well. So what we're going to do now is just move to the last section, which is called the Take Action Round. And it's just some quick fire questions to give some tangible action to our BLG community. So the first question is, what's your number one personal productivity tip?
For me, it's running and finding that physical outlet or meditative outlet that means I'm not thinking about work, that I'm improving my spirituality or my physical and mental state.
Okay, excellent. And on your home phone, sorry, on your mobile phone, on your home screen, what are some apps that you really couldn't live without?
The Google suite of products, so Drive, Calendar, and email. I think the integration of all of that in one is really convenient. We use Trello for project management. That's been and that's recently been acquired by Atlassian, I think. So there's improvements there, or better things to come there. And then I find LinkedIn to be a really powerful tool. That's actually how I met my co-founders, through LinkedIn. So I think that's a really important productivity tool that sometimes gets dismissed as unhelpful social media.
Great. And from a podcast or a book, what's sort of your favorite podcast or book that you're reading or listening to at the moment?
I'm actually so from a podcast perspective, Rohit Bhargava, who used to work for Startup Victoria and has since been recording podcasts with some of Melbourne and Sydney's most prominent startup ecosystem representatives, runs a weekly or a fortnightly podcast. I can't recall the name of it, but I usually check that out, and I'll provide the details later.
Yeah, sure.
Rohit
Put that
Bhargava
in the show notes.
Yeah, Rohit Bhargava. And from a reading perspective, I had a recommendation this morning to check out Who Gives a Crap What Other People Think. It's been going around a bit. I'm sure I've got the title wrong. The subtle art of not giving a crap, I think, is the word. It's meant to be very good. It's the second recommendation I've heard of it. And I have to admit that I actually don't read business books or self-help books a great deal. I probably overdosed on them during my MBA. And I now read pretty much on weekends and at night fiction books, because I find, if I'm not running or if I'm too tired to run, escaping into a fiction book is my way of tuning out.
Excellent. And what's one piece of advice that you wish you had have received earlier in your startup journey that you can now share with the BLG community?
When I was trying to decide whether to leave and how to leave, I caught up with a good friend who's also a co-founder of one of Melbourne's, one of a great Melbourne startup that's going through a tremendous growth trajectory. They're called Roulette. And as I was umming and ahhing about the opportunity cost of leaving and what the risks were, he just laughed and he said, "What's the worst that can go wrong? If it all goes right, you make $1 billion and you have a great deal of fun on the journey. And if it goes wrong and you leave and whatever you do next doesn't work out, then you've learned more than anyone else or than you would have doing anything else. And you've had a lot more fun than if you'd stayed in the corporate world." And I think that was actually the bit of advice that probably prompted me to take the leap, that the worst that can happen isn't that great a deal.
Yeah, look, I think that's wise words and great advice. So how could people find out more about you, Alexander and Airly?
I keep my LinkedIn profile up to date. I'm easily searchable, Alexander Robinson, probably with Airly in there as well if you need to find me. And that has a few links to, I try writing. I love writing both for a professional audience as well as trying my hand at some creative writing. So there's a few links on LinkedIn where if people want to see what I'm up to, that's the best place to start. And then about Airly, best place to go is our new website, which relaunched about 2 weeks ago, flyairly.com.
Excellent. And that plus other links that you've spoken of in the podcast, we'll definitely have them in the show notes. So look, thanks for sharing your journey. I've since we met, as you said, there's been quite a few pivots, not in the end destination, but definitely the way that you're adding value to clients. But I think that's really critical in your path to being successful, is getting that right. And I think you're doing that. well done. The funding, I know, is always the difficult part, but I'm sure you'll get there. And we really look forward to not just following your journey, but hopefully using your wonderful service in the month and years to come. So on behalf of the BLG listeners, I'd love to thank you for sharing your journey today, and we wish you every success in the future.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for bringing this community together. It's much needed and it's very valuable and worthwhile.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Alexander. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to the Build, Live, Give show. If you found this show helpful, please share it with others so we can build businesses, live great lives, and give back to the community. If you would like to join the BLG community, go to our website, www.buildlivegive.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.